First of all, I would like to pay my highest respect to His Excellency Professor Nekbarom, the Vice President of the International University. Greetings, judges, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Sandy Sim, the first-year medical student from the Faculty of Medicine and Pediatrics. I'm honored to be here and present you a speech which is about things you should know about Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's is a brain disorder that slowly destroys your memory and thinking skills. It causes you to lose your memory, especially when you're old. How many people here would like to live to be at least 80 years old? I think we all have these expectations, but I'm sorry to inform you that with this expectation, we will face Alzheimer's, some of us here. Alzheimer's is a terrifying disease because we can do nothing about it. Despite decades of research, we still have no disease-modifying treatment and no cure. So if we're lucky enough to live long enough, Alzheimer's appears to be our brain's destiny. But maybe it doesn't have to be. What if I told you that we could change this statistic, literally change our brain's destiny without relying on a cure or advancements in medicines? Let's begin by what we currently understand about the neuroscience of Alzheimer's. Here's a picture of two neurons connecting. The point of connection, the space circled in red, is called the synapse. The synapse is where neurotransmitters are released, where signals are transmitted, where communication happens, where we think, feel, hear, desire, remember, and the synapse is where Alzheimer's happens. During the business of communicating information, in addition to releasing neurotransmitters like glutamate into the synapse, the neurons also release a small peptide called amyloid beta. Normally, amyloid beta is cleared away or metabolized by microglia, the genital cells in our brain. And the disease begins when the amyloid beta begins to accumulate. Too much is released or not enough is cleared away. And the microglia, the genital cells in our brain, become hyperactivated, releasing chemicals that cause inflammations and cellular damage. A crucial neurotransport protein called tau becomes hyperactivated and it twists itself into something called tangles, which choke off the neurons from the inside. And when the amyloid beta begins to accumulate, it binds to itself, forming a sticky aggregate called amyloid plaques. And those plaques and tangles started to choke off the neurons and it destroyed the brain cells. Now, let me tell you what are those risk factors that lead to Alzheimer's. We have DNA, aging, sleep deprivations, and also cardiovascular disease. Because 80% of people with Alzheimer's also had cardiovascular disease like hypertension, diabetes, obesity, smoking, all have been shown to increase our risk of developing Alzheimer's. So, if you were a scientist trying to cure this disease, at what point would you ideally want to intervene? Many scientists are betting big on the simplest solution, keep amyloid plaques from reaching the tipping point, which means that drug discovery is largely focused on developing a compound which will prevent, eliminate, or reduce the accumulation of amyloid plaques. So the cure of Alzheimer's will likely be a preventative medicine. We're going to have to take this pill before we reach the tipping point. We think this is why to date, these kinds of drugs have failed in clinical trials. Not because the science wasn't sound, but because the people in these trials were already symptomatic. It was too late. Think of amyloid plaque as a lit match. At the tipping point, the match sets fire to the forest. Once the forest is ablaze, it doesn't do any good to blow out the match. You have to blow out the match before the forest catches fire. This information is actually really good news for us because it turns out that the way we live can influence the accumulation of amyloid plaques. And so there are things we can do to prevent us from reaching the tipping point. There are many things we can do to prevent or delay the onset of Alzheimer's. But let's say you haven't done any of them. Let's say you're 65, there's Alzheimer's in your family, so you've likely inherited a gene or two. You love bacon, you've been doing a lot of work, you don't exercise, you don't run unless someone's chasing you. Let's imagine that your amyloid plaques have reached the tipping point. You should be symptomatic for Alzheimer's. But don't worry. There's one more thing you can do to prevent yourself from experiencing the symptom of Alzheimer's, even if you have the full-blown disease pathology ablaze in your brain. It has to do with neuroplasticity and cognitive reserve. Remember, the experience of having Alzheimer's is ultimately a result of losing synapses. The average brain has over 100 trillion synapses, which is fantastic. We've got a lot to work with. And this is an static number. We gain and lose synapses all the time through a process called neuroplasticity. Every time we learn something new, we are creating and strengthening new neural connections, new synapses. People who have more years of formal education, who have a high degree of literacy, or who engage regularly in mentally stimulating activities all have more cognitive reserve. They have an abundance and a redundancy in neural connections. So even if they have a disease like Alzheimer's compromising some of their synapses, they've got many extra backup connections. Let's imagine a simplified example. Let's say you only know one thing about a subject. Let's say it's about me. You know that Sandy is one of the contestants in the public speaking competition. Or imagine you know that Cindy is the champion of the public speaking competition. That's the only thing you know about me. You have that single neural connections, that one synapse. Now imagine you have Alzheimer's. You have plaques, tangles, inflammations, and microglia devouring that synapse. Now when someone asks you, do you know Cindy? No, you can't remember because that one synapse is either failing or gone. You've forgotten me forever. But what if you learn more about me? Let's say you learn 4 things about me. Now imagine you have Alzheimer's and 3 of those synapses are destroyed. You still have 1 synapse left, and you can still remember my name. So we can be resilient to the presence of Alzheimer's pathology through the recruitment of yet undamaged pathways. And we create these pathways, this cognitive reserve, by learning new things. This brings me to my conclusion that Alzheimer's is still one of the most terrifying diseases we would face in the future. And hopefully this speech will become a useful guide for you to prevent it. And if, despite all of this, you are someday diagnosed with Alzheimer's, there are 3 lessons you should remember. Diagnosis doesn't mean that you're dying tomorrow, so keep living. You will not lose your emotional memory. You'll still be able to understand love and joy. And you are more than what you can remember.